snow last night, so but wish I was in DrupalCon in Boston instead. So this session is called Reimagining the Wysiwyg, so welcome. If you're able to watch the Drupal 10 readiness keynote this morning, you may have some context already, but in this talk, I'll go into more detail about why we're working on CKEditor 5 and what it could mean for Drupal and how you can get involved. So my name is Peter Weber. Oh yeah, I'm so sorry. 1 second. Thanks for the reminder. Let me just turn the captions on real quick. So my name is Peter Weber, and I've been a Drupal developer for around 12 years. 1 second. Sorry, I'm getting used to the present, getting used to hop in. So I've let me start over. My name is Peter Weber. I've been a Drupal developer for around 12 years, mostly working at agencies or sometimes freelance. I've been at Acquia for the past 2 years as a member of the Drupal acceleration team, where I've had the opportunity to work on Drupal core, specifically with some of the JavaScript modernization initiatives, and then most recently working on upgrading the CKEditor. So I'm going to talk about CKEditor 5 and why we're trying to add it to Drupal core. But first, I wanted to give a little background information on how CKEditor got into Drupal. If you're not familiar with the history of CKEditor in Drupal, it was released with Drupal 8.0, which was close to a decade ago. So adding useful tools into core was a big deal at the time. Drupal 7 had added fields, so you didn't need to install CCK. And then in Drupal 8, we got even more in core, such as views. It's great this year at DrupalCon, we have an entire initiative day for easy out of the box, but this has been a trend with Drupal for years. When Drupal 8 released, there were lots of options for Wysiwyg with Drupal, but not one that was ready as soon as you install the site, which would make it easy out of the box or straight out of the box. So at the time, adding CKEditor in core was an out of the box improvement. So this talk is about reimagining the Wysiwyg, but why does it need to be reimagined? I think it's worth explaining that although a Wysiwyg may be really useful for a content creator, it has historically been at odds with adding structured content or making a site layout that worked the way a designer pictured it. In Karen McGrain's keynote at DrupalCon Portland back in 2013, I think, she railed against the Wysiwyg for letting you edit blobs of content. The presentation is mixed into the data and impossible to separate. Blobs are the enemy of structured chunks of content, which is what we try to make in Drupal. In a confession, I was in the crowd cheering when this slide came up. So I just mentioned that I worked in agencies for the bulk of my career, and the Wysiwyg was always a challenge. In some ways, it offers a lot of promise, but in other ways, it adds a layer of frustration when a user can't place a style in just the right spot, or gets stuck, in a bulleted list, or you can't stop typing inside a heading. The promise that you can style content exactly the way it appears on the screen, but that rarely happens. You're either too limited and you don't have the flexibility you'd have when actually editing HTML, or you're just editing HTML and you have too much freedom and no guardrails. So using a Wysiwyg reminded me of Dreamweaver, and I know I'm dating myself a bit to even show this, but I remember clicking around in the graphical mode and just getting lost and getting stuck. And as soon as I knew enough HTML, I never used that visual mode again, because I could write better HTML than some GUI, some GUI that was trying to interpret my mouse drags and clicks. So I'm sure, like many of you, I clicked the View Source button in the Wysiwyg, and I jumped into HTML mode whenever I needed to fix a problem. However, that's not always an answer for a client. I've worked both with clients who didn't want to touch HTML and with clients who knew too much and started writing their own styles and ended up with pages that didn't match the original designs at all. CKEditor 5 has an internal data model for parsing a document. That's why not just any arbitrary HTML will work, and why you can't just toggle over to View Source and make your own edits. You can read this GitHub thread to see some of the frustration and anger from the community, and also the incredible patience and thoughtfulness of the CK Source team and their responses. For many people in that thread, the idea of not being able to click over and fix the HTML is a deal breaker. How can you have a WYSIWYG without a way to override it or make edits that you can't do in the UI? At first, I didn't get it either. My past experience had me feeling like the WYSIWYG, or WYSIWYGs in general, are not trustworthy and not reliable, and you can't accomplish what you want to. And some of my former colleagues have even recently declared the body field dead. I wouldn't have disagreed with that 6 months ago. This is largely because of what I mentioned, that complex content in the body field that is unmanageable, it's difficult to style consistently, and it's risky to hand off to a client who either doesn't know enough HTML or knows too much and will make the site look drastically different than a designer intended in just a few months of edits. So what could be better? If we don't allow markup areas, then how do we achieve flexible layouts? How do we empower a content creator to both craft any page they need while still giving preset options that will preserve the site design? In Drupal, we often reach for a solution like nested paragraphs to embed specific components exactly on the page where we want them. This can be exactly what a developer needs, creating component types, having full control over the template, although it can be a ton of extra work. However, it can feel a bit heavy-handed. Creating a paragraph type for a 2-column layout means making a paragraph that just has 2 slots for actual content paragraphs. Even with a nicer UI, it gets you farther away from the content and it becomes more and more abstract. This can be tough both for a content creator as well as a developer. And if you have a decoupled site, what do you get when you fetch this node? You get references to IDs, which in turn reference other IDs. So you get farther away from the content. When I started working on how to add CKEditor 5 to core, I read a lot of documentation and examples. And something that changed for me was realizing for all we talk about structured content, we're mostly trying to solve layout or add a nice looking reusable component wherever we want on the page. If we're still building HTML pages, why not just make it easier to add HTML components? They can be structured and they can avoid the div soup that we end up with in Drupal sometimes with field and entity templates as they get nested deeper and deeper. So to illustrate this, I made a couple simple plugins. One of them is a card type layout with a title and a body. I think this is a pretty common pattern. My version of it may not be very pretty, but it gets the idea across. You have something where you want to be able to edit the title and you want to edit the body separately, and that's a really common pattern that you want to add to your site. So the markup is set, and it's unchangeable by a site builder. And they don't need to know what markup or what class names to add where. But a designer and a developer could work together to come up with a component like this and add it as an option for their client. Because the markup is known, you can add CSS that targets it, and you can have a simple and predictable but rich way to add something unique anywhere on the page without having to plan ahead with paragraph types and entity reference revision fields. The second example was to take that same simple box or card, and instead of a title and a body, I made 2 body text areas with just a little CSS, and you have a simple, responsive 2-column layout. You could even add a card into the columns. You can imagine building out a large component library over time, or sharing these among your organization or even with the community. All you're creating is markup, and the UI, of course. So it's simple, portable, and flexible. Whatever CSS you add could completely change for each theme, but the content creator always has a consistent experience. And that seems pretty clean to me. A nested paragraph would give you the same kind of markup on the page, but it might be a lot more work. And that markup doesn't have to be completely static either. If you expose options in the UI and to the CKEditor 5 config, you can create a component that could serve different purposes on different sites. If you had to describe this plugin, you could use YAML, for example. It needs a label for the drop-down menu and a modifier for the class name. Your plugin config could have as many or as few options as you need. And once you built this plugin, you could change this config and never need to edit any JavaScript again. So to me, this has an appealing simplicity. creating a component and allowing it to be added right to the page. Now your editor is more of a UI for adding structured content than it is just a free text field editor. It's pulling you away from dumping blobs of content on the page, but it's still much more free, simple, and open in figuring out how to nest the right entity reference. And if you're still concerned about having a lot of bloated markup in the body field, consider how Drupal already handles media elements. So this is not valid HTML, but Drupal recognizes it. The entity UUID tells Drupal where to find the entity, and the current format tells how to render it. And this is exactly what we have to save in the database. There's no view source button in CKEditor 5 because there's no source, or rather the source it saves is not the same as the source you see when you're editing. You're not seeing what you get, you're editing content, and it's saving HTML, and not even the same HTML it's showing you. Maybe it's not even saving HTML at all. One plugin for CKEditor 5 transforms your output straight into Markdown. Think again about that Drupal media element. The editor saves a preview, the editor displays a preview, but it saves really minimal markup that the front end, whether it's Drupal rendering the page or maybe some other web app, knows how to display. You're visually editing and you're placing content where you want it, but that's not determining what you're saving to the database. This is another example from the CKEditor docs. They're using React to render a list of products, and you can add from that menu of products right into CKEditor 5. The editor view is printing HTML, and that's that top code example. It's effectively adding a React component, which is then rendered out as a product preview. However, the data, which is saved to the text area, is nothing like that. It's simply an element with enough info for some other front end to render. To me, that element with a data attribute or a Drupal media element, they both look a little like web components. I saw Chris Bloom and Adam Duran's excellent web components talk yesterday, and it got me thinking that this could be something special. You could visually add the components you want, where you want, but you save a simple element to the database. And then some front end somewhere takes that element and renders it however it's appropriate for the application it ends up on. So what if this takes off? You could create web components or even just regular HTML components to reuse on your sites. But the real power is when a community gets a hold of it, adopts it, and reaches a critical mass. I think there's a lot of potential with adding CKEditor 5 to Drupal. It's not just a necessary upgrade, but something that could change how we build sites. It's up to us to build the module in a way that makes it easy to add plugins so that developers and site builders can click together whatever they need. So CKEditor 5, as I mentioned, is a completely new editor. It's completely changed from CKEditor 4. It features a custom data model, which makes adding and changing text much more consistent and reliable. So even something as simple as just typing and formatting content works better and feels better. It has a robust plugin system for modifying almost any feature and altering or using any UI pattern. But it wasn't certain that CKEditor 5 was the obvious replacement for CKEditor and Core. So like with PHP 7 or Composer 1, the next move is obvious. But for CKEditor, is it? There's other Wysiwygs out there. And since it's not a simple upgrade, but a full replacement, kind of like Drupal 7 to 8, it's not so clear that we have to stay with CKEditor and upgrade to 5. So like all things in Drupal, this was a community discussion. And at the end, CKEditor 5 was chosen for several reasons, but notably because of the long and successful working relationship between CK Source and the Drupal community. Just to illustrate that point, when I was working on a weird bug with required fields, I ran across this issue from 10 years ago. And I saw some familiar names. There's Wim and Nod commenting 8 years ago and helping to fix this bug, which eventually got landed by Piotr. So the thought that CK Source would continue to be helpful has completely been validated as well. That was one of the justifications for choosing CKEditor 5, but it's already become true because Piotr is now the lead engineer on CKEditor 5, and he and his team have been really helpful so far. With frequent meetings, they've jumped into Drupal Slack, and they even comment on issues in D.O. It's not just a matter of swapping out JavaScript or replacing a module. CKEditor is deeply embedded in Drupal, connected through the editor system, tied into Quick Edit, and configured and managed by filters and text formats. It also has a completely different plugin system than CKEditor 5 does now, and allowed for contributed modules to extend and alter it. It's also raised questions of how we're going to handle using modern JavaScript apps in Drupal. CKEditor 5 is written in modern JavaScript, and all the packages are published in NPM. One big question early on was, how are we going to add or remove plugins the way we're used to in Drupal? For example, having a contributed project that adds its own plugin. If you're using a custom build, each plugin must be imported, and then you would run a build step to get your compiled editor. So how could this work in Drupal? So one huge change that the CK source team worked on was untangling the dependencies of each of their packages and using Webpack to build the project into many smaller JavaScript files. This made it possible to load individual JavaScript files that were pre-built, or enabling another Drupal module with its own JavaScript that can load with CKEditor 5 without having to run a Webpack command and compile a new build. This made a massive difference for development and really made the Drupal project possible. You can see how now we can just add JavaScript files using Drupal's existing library system to make this work. Rather than having to import JavaScript files, compile them, we're just adding compiled JavaScript as just a script tag. So big thank you to the CK source team for even thinking of this solution and then doing all the work to implement it. CKEditor 5 was designed to be completely alterable with plugins, from adding elements, changing attributes or styles, to outputting content as Markdown. When planning the Drupal module, a big goal was to make it as easy as possible for developers to add their own plugins for either adding features or modifying existing settings. This annotation describes a Drupal CKEditor 5 plugin. It's a comment in a PHP file. This is discoverable by the plugin manager, and this is how pretty much every plugin in Drupal works. I struggle a bit because CKEditor calls their extensions plugins, and so does Drupal, and Drupal has a whole plugin system. And so this annotation is a Drupalism, and you'll see this a lot throughout Drupal core and throughout your custom modules. So this annotation is automatically discoverable by the plugin manager, and it has information about the library to include, the JS and CSS files. It also has information on the plugin classes that CKEditor needs to load, and it can have static config, which is passed into CKEditor at runtime. If your plugin requires information from Drupal, for example, the media preview URL, plugins provide a method for setting that config before it gets passed into CKEditor. I personally think that the PHP annotation syntax is a bit difficult to read and parse. It's also likely you don't need a PHP class to fetch settings or config from Drupal for most CKEditor plugins. Maybe the majority of the functionality of the plugin is already in JavaScript, and all you really need to do is to tell it to load. If that's the case, that exact same annotation could be written in YAML instead. I think this is much easier to read and write, and if you're a JavaScript developer, you may be happy not to have to write any PHP at all. On the other hand, if your module is changing an existing plugin's config, maybe you don't need to write any JavaScript either. You could make a form to save and edit these settings instead of hard-coding them in YAML. You can also write the annotation in YAML and then point to a PHP class if you still need one. That's kind of the best of both worlds because you don't have to write the PHP annotation, but you still can write custom PHP if you need information from Drupal. In the CKEditor 5 module, there's examples of all three. Annotation that's just in YAML, annotation that's in YAML with plugin code in PHP, and then everything in a single PHP file. So altogether in a Drupal module that provides a CKEditor 5 plugin, this is just a contributed module I created called Layer Cake that provides the two plugins that I demoed earlier, the little card and the two-column layout. So this Drupal module includes everything that you need to add that into Drupal. It has an info file that tells Drupal about the module. It has a libraries file that tells Drupal where the JavaScript and CSS are. And then the ckeditor.yaml file defines the plugin itself. So the info.yaml file is familiar to you if you've ever made a Drupal module. The only important part here is that we're adding a dependency on the CKEditor 5 module. The libraries file looks a bit more complicated, but most of it is just documenting where the source code is from. I'm telling Drupal where to find the JavaScript in the JavaScript build folder and listing the location of the repo for a developer. The JavaScript should not be preprocessed by Drupal, and it's already minified. I'm also adding a little CSS here too. The CKEditor.yaml file contains the actual plugin definition. I'm pointing to the library I just defined in the libraries.yaml. I'm adding the plugins by their package name and their class name, which I'll talk about in a minute. Toolbar items and admin library are additional config just for the Toolbar UI. And elements are to help validate Drupal's HTML filter so that if it's enabled, we can add these elements and attributes to an allow list so that they can be rendered on the page. To briefly explain the CKEditor 5 plugin structure, I created a repo that includes 2 example CK5 plugins, the toCall and the simple box. The index.js file exports those 2 classes, simple box and toCall. In Webpack, besides pointing to where the CKEditor 5 repo is so that the imports make sense, I name the package. This means my plugins can be referred to by the package and their class. So you see that layercake.toCall and layercake.simplebox, that becomes what I actually add into the YAML under the plugin list. Once you've compiled your JavaScript, the Drupal module is mostly metadata. So the hope is that it makes adding new plugins straightforward without needing to learn a lot about Drupal. If we're going to build a healthy ecosystem of contributed modules, the main module needs to do all the heavy lifting and also set good examples for how to build plugins that integrate with Drupal. So where are we now with that main module? The plan is to get CKEditor 5 in core and stable for Drupal 10, but that means it really needs to be in core, at least in beta, by 9.3 or 9.4 at the latest. The original work for this project was right in core as an issue fork, but after some time it became complex enough that it was hard to keep track of what had been done and what was remaining. We decided to follow in the footsteps of giants. Layout Builder, JSON API, and Media all began a contrib and moved to core once they were close to stable. Working on a contrib project also gave us our own issue queue and a consistent workflow with the new merge requests. It is functional, but it's still missing some important features to match CK4. And we want people to use it and try to extend it so that we can solve the problems early and make sure that by the time it's in Drupal 10, there's a healthy ecosystem around it. With the module installed, you can navigate to a text format and add CKEditor 5 as your text editor. We built a new toolbar UI with no dependency on jQuery or Backbone. You can use it to drag and drop the toolbar items you want for this format. It was also built with accessibility in mind and supports keyboard movement for adding, removing, and sorting buttons, and ARIA Live announcements to describe the current status and options. CKEditor 5 is integrated with the format page. Plugins can be made aware of filter settings. For example, if you have the media module enabled and you check the embed media, it will activate the CKEditor 5 Drupal media plugin, which supports that element. And if you check allow image uploads, it will enable you to add an image inline to the content and change other settings. I mentioned this because we wanted to make integration with the format page much more simple than it had been before. So Drupal CKEditor 5 plugins are designed to make validation warnings as well easier to set up without having to write any form alters. We already added a lot of the basic plugins such as bold, italic, strike through, and block quote. And whenever possible, we're using CKEditor 5's improvements, such as on a link, href. You get the little balloon pop-up. In my opinion, it's a little bit of an improvement over Drupal's dialog overlay, which you can see in the CKEditor 4 example on the left. Like media entities, inserted images get data entity UUID attributes so that Drupal can keep track of its assets. Inserting an image can be done by browsing for an image on your computer. Again, no dialog used here. Or even with drag and drop directly from your computer. CKEditor 5 also supports adding multiple images at once. We created our own CKEditor 5 plugin for parsing Drupal media elements. In the editor view, the plugin uses Drupal to fetch a media preview to display in the editor, which is held in a special type of CKEditor 5 container called a raw element. And that displays exactly as it renders to the page. If you enable the media library toolbar button, you can insert Drupal media right into the editor. By letting you browse media library, you can select any existing entity. This does use a dialog, so sometimes Drupal's UI is still the best choice. CKEditor 5 has different builds. The classic editor, which we used on nodes. The balloon editor, which looks a lot like Quick Edit. But for Quick Edit, we actually used their decoupled editor, which lets us add the toolbar UI separately from the editable area. So now you can click Quick Edit, click a text area field, and you'll have the same controls in Quick Edit like you would from using the node edit form. There's lots more plugins. You can browse the CKEditor 5 docs or search npm for CKEditor 5 to see other plugins that are available. There's probably some we should add now, like special characters or a table. There's also new plugins that were not available in CKEditor 4, such as the to-do list, or restricted editing for creating forms or repeatable content like invoices. These could be great candidates for contrib projects. Some of the most exciting features are paid services provided by CK Source. Imagine working on the same node with multiple colleagues at once and having your changes autosaved. Or leaving comments for reviewers to discuss changes right inside Drupal, accepting or rejecting suggestions, just like you would in Google Docs. There are a lot of possibilities that we haven't even touched yet. If you like some of the ideas I proposed, or you're interested in getting started or either using CKEditor 5 or writing your own plugins, we need to move quickly. The Drupal community has kept CKEditor updated in core, both keeping up with new releases and adding features that get added to core like media library integration. But all good things come to an end. CKEditor 4 itself will have long-term support until 2023, which means anyone running Drupal 8 or 9 will be able to continue to get security fixes. However, for Drupal's lifecycle, that actually is one of the factors for the forced end of life of Drupal 9. Dries and others have explained this better than I could, but for Drupal 10, we must have all the software removed from core. More specifically, to deprecate CKEditor in core in time to remove it for Drupal 10, we must have a viable replacement by 9.3 or 9.4 at the latest. Then there's thousands of sites running CKEditor that need a migration path. We don't want to leave any Drupal sites behind. D9 has committed us to easy upgrades forever, so we need a path forward. We have about a month to get the CKEditor 5 module ready for beta and land it in core so that we can deprecate CKEditor by the fall. With CKEditor 5, we don't only have to think in terms of HTML, but rather focus on a good user experience it can provide and come up with some creative ways to empower content creators to make the layout that they need without worrying about implementation. So I hope you saw some features that made you optimistic or inspired you to get involved. Chat anytime in Drupal Slack at CKEditor 5, or jump in the issue queue or make a contrib project and let me know how it goes. Thank you. I think we have a little time for Q&A. I saw there's a ton of chat. It's really hard to do a presentation with Hopin because you have so much to look at. So Ryan asks, what if the client is the site builder? The content owner submits content to site builder, then they determine how best to promote the content. Content owner submits content to site builder. Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the goal here, is that you're empowering your site builders to make these things with sort of low code solutions. Like you can create a component that is reusable and or create any sort of plugin that fits your content needs. Let's see. Nick asks, can you access any of that data in queries though, like with paragraphs, or is it the same issue as CKEditor 4 plugins like the media entity and embeds? Yeah, I think that's the idea, that you still are creating a blob of text. You're still creating a chunk of content, but it's in some ways I think it's simpler, but maybe you can't access it in the same way that you would where you would dive in. With media elements though, with media entity, of course you can make a view of media entities anywhere else. Why not integrate layouts with paragraphs for better UI? I think there is a module for that. I think there's layout paragraphs if you're interested in that kind of structure. It says, the content would be structured and more importantly configurable. Content, so John asked, what are trade-offs between CKEditor 5 and Layout Builder? I think that you could accomplish goals in lots of different ways in Drupal. I would think that if you're going to use CKEditor 5, maybe my examples could be a bit contrived, or maybe you could think of some better ones. But the idea is that you could create elements that that would look good within a single field or within a single body text. Whereas with Layout Builder, you can arrange fields on the page and eventually be able to arrange blocks everywhere as well. Kevin asks, is this compatible with web components? Yeah, so that's kind of what I was getting at, is I thought that you could create your own web components and save them, and it seems like it would be a way forward, and it's kind of an exciting possibility. And I'd definitely be eager to talk to you more about that. Shalane asks, what kind of migration will be required for sites that have used CKEditor 4? So migration is a tricky part because you have to think about the HTML that you have on your page. So if you have very, very plain, ordinary HTML, then the migration should be fairly straightforward. If you have very complex HTML, very custom stuff like divs with class names, you may have a tougher time. The CKEditor, CK Source team is working on a migration path because it's a really important issue for their customers as well as for all the Drupal people. And so that's something that they're actively working on. Christoph asks, how would tokens be made available from these plugins? I'm not sure. I guess we'd have to make a plugin that supported it. I'm not sure. I know that's kind of a weak answer, but I think that you could. It's not something that we have an answer for at the moment, but it's still in active development. Frank asked about CKEditor 5. Sounds exactly like Gutenberg, and there's also an existing Gutenberg contrib module. You can check that issue that I posted where there's the discussion on deciding between CKEditor 5 and other options. Gutenberg was brought up there, but I think that one of the reasons they chose not to go with Gutenberg is because it's sort of a drastic departure from what we have already, and so we wanted to make this upgrade as smooth as possible. There's a ton more questions. I'll just keep answering them. Sorry, I lost my place. Is it still possible to use CKEditor 5 for users to break HTML markup? Is it still possible for CKEditor 5 for users to break HTML markup when deleting or clearing stylized markup? I don't think so. I mean, because if the idea is that CKEditor 5 it parses the HTML that's in the existing HTML, and so if there was some stylized markup, yeah, I guess I'm not super clear on that question, but I think in general, if you're creating new content with CKEditor 5, you're going to have a much more reliable result. You're not going to have to worry about broken HTML. Ryan asks, how can I fully trust the Wysiwyg? I need to see how the code gets parsed so I can determine if it's semantic and accessible. If, for example, if the editor outputs a span when I intended for an H2. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that the answer is that the CKEditor 5 is much more reliable in terms of its document model and how it outputs data. And of course, you can always see how the code gets parsed, and you know it's going to be the same every time. There's a lot of ways of getting the data out, of testing it. You can also write your own plugins for making sure that the output is exactly what you expect. John asks, will CKEditor 4 have a contrib module for D10? Yeah, I think that's a good, that is the plan, because we don't want to take away anybody's experiences, and we want to make sure that CKEditor 4 is still available. We just want to make sure that it's deprecated in Drupal 9 so that we can not have to support it in Drupal 10. But if you want to add it to your own site, then absolutely. We did the same thing with jQuery UI. We added a lot of jQuery UI contrib projects as we were removing it from core. I keep clicking back to chat and then losing my place. Leonardo asks, I use custom JavaScript and CSS code on custom blocks, but then I can apply to different sections or pages within the block layout. How can we achieve this if CKEditor 5 doesn't have a source button? And I'm not sure if this is exactly what you mean, but that's sort of what I was trying to get at with creating your own components, that if you create your own custom blocks and you want to apply to different sections, you can create a little plugin for that you can then inject right into your editor. So rather than pasting it as source, you're actually creating it in advance and then making a way to insert that. Frank asks, can you explain how CKEditor blocks work so everyone understands how content is stored as a structured block and not HTML, which is why it isn't source editable. So it is still stored as HTML. I mean, I suppose you can, as I mentioned, there's plugins for outputting your content in different formats. Like you could have Markdown instead. But just by default, it's storing HTML. And so it is still, I suppose you could always just turn CKEditor off on your field and you'd still be able to edit the source because the HTML is still being saved in the database. Nathan asks, would the page layout break if a content editor changes the input filter from CKEditor to full HTML? Sometimes view source is useful. How can a content editor manually edit HTML if the need arises? So there is a warning now. So if you switch from restricted to full HTML, you do get a warning already that you could be breaking your content. The the real issue is whether full HTML allows more content than CKEditor does. And so if you had your CKEditor on a basic HTML and you switched to full, and then you went in and added source, and then flip back, you might have some trouble with that content. But if you just stick with CKEditor, I think that you won't have to worry about editing your HTML manually. And I hope that, like, one of the points I was trying to get across in this talk is that you should hopefully not have to think about the HTML that you're inserting into the Wysiwyg, because you've already, planned it in advance and you know exactly what it's going to be. Josh asks, he said, you said CK5 works with the media library. Does it allow linking to documents in the media library inline by default? That's been a big bugaboo with CK4. Linking to documents in the media library inline. I guess I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, but yeah, if it's not doing what you expect it to, then please open an issue in the module. Right now, we're able to browse the media library and just inject content right into the text area. But if you see an issue with it, then feel free to create a bug report. Michael asks, are these media entities automatically created in the media library for the images that are dragged and dropped in CKEditor? Yeah, so I cheated a bit by using the Umami installations. The Umami profile already has a bunch of media entities created. And so if you create those elsewhere, you can insert them anywhere, and then insert them right into CKEditor. Anonymous asks, why would we choose to continue with the next version of an editor which has forced us to edit HTML for years and has forced us to teach HTML to our clients? Well, you're welcome to turn it off, I suppose. I think that I'm hoping that the new version of CKEditor will make life easier for your clients, and you won't have to teach them HTML anymore. On the other hand, if they'd like to edit some of their own plugins, they can create their own markup and make something that's a useful and repeatable component. Luke asks, is there a better mechanism to apply block styles in CK5? I'm not gonna be able to click the link right now, but there's some things that there's like automatic mechanisms. Like there's a plugin called link decorators, and you can do things like if a link is to a PDF, you can automatically add a class. And so there's a lot of programmatic things you can do for applying styles. And then yeah, like I said, you can create your own components for whatever you need. Ben asks, where does CKEditor end and Layout Builder begin? Seems the lines will become fuzzy. And yeah, and maybe that's my fault for using a layout example, but I wanted to just give an idea of what you could accomplish with CKEditor. I think that Layout Builder is still going to serve its main purpose for laying out an entire page. With CKEditor, it's just about controlling and having more power within the body field. Emmons asked, will I publish the slides? Yes, I definitely will. Sorry, I haven't done that yet, but I have it in Google Slides and it's ready to go. Anthony asks, are there thoughts to have Media Browser as the default media embedder? Media is fine for individual users, but for organizations with several users, as media is often shared. Yes, absolutely. There's an open issue about migrating inline images. That's an existing feature of CKEditor 4 that predated Media Library. And so there is actually an issue already in our project to make inline images automatically create a media element, and then eventually migrate that over to just media. So I think the long-term plan is that Media Browser and Media Library, excuse me, is going to be standard in core, and it'll be something we can count on and use that by default. James asked, without view source, how do we support use cases where content gets broken by pasted content? That's tricky for sure, but the CKEditor 5 does support better paste from Word. And so hopefully you'll be able to work around that. It'll also clean it up automatically for you, because whenever it's importing HTML, it matches it to the document model that it has. And so you may not be able to accomplish every single thing that you have in Word, but in general, you'll be able to paste it in and have a layout that's a bit cleaner. Yeah, and then the same question from Michael Cooper about cleanly pasting from Word. Yeah, I think we'll just have to try that out and see how the new CKEditor 5 word paste works and see if it's any better. Max asked, without view source, how does one move around or reorder embedded entities when the Wysiwyg sometimes makes this extremely finicky or impossible? So I found that it works a bit better than CKEditor 4 in terms of, like, you can click on something and then cut and paste the whole element. So like that card example I showed, you can actually cut and paste an entire card with title and body already filled in. Same thing with media elements. You can click the little button to add a new line below it. So I think the UI has improved quite a bit. Leonardo asks, CKEditor doesn't let you write JavaScript code then? This is sad. Well, I mean, you can absolutely write all the JavaScript you want with CKEditor. You can really go nuts writing JavaScript with CKEditor. But as far as injecting CKEditor right into the editor, I don't think that would be a good idea. And yeah, and XJM posted as well. But we don't want to enable XSS as a feature. Tracking use of media entities. I'm not an expert on that, but I believe that that's something you can already do in core. And that's one of the reasons that we have data entity attributes on media and image elements that get added to body fields. Yeah, and then Frank also says, how are we going to allow our clients to write XSS if we cannot write JavaScript? Yeah, I'm sorry, Frank. You can open a feature request if you want to make sure that happens, but we probably won't work on it. Anyway, well, thank you very much. There's a contrib session, contribution event this afternoon, or for me, it's this afternoon. For some of you, maybe tonight. And I'd like to see some of you there, and you can also jump into Slack and chat with me there. And hopefully some of your ideas and some of your concerns we can address either through new plugins or through bug fixes or whatever you can think of. So I'm looking forward to talking to you more about it.